we're back on track this evening in terms of the lesson sheets that we have. And so I think we've got this week's lesson, next week's lessons, and then I'll prepare. I thought I might try to get those done. I did not. But we'll have those ready by next week, at least the following one. And just as we got started on 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we're going to go back over to 1st and 2nd Kings, and I'll show you why here in a moment. But we're going to take this evening's lesson and think together about the northern kingdom of Israel once the kingdom divides, and try to get an idea of what's happening there. There are 19 different kings that reigned during the northern kingdom, 9 dynasties as a part of that, so we'll look at all that. So I'm not expecting us or myself to remember all of those, but I think if we look at them as a whole and kind of get some idea of what was happening, and as we think of that particularly related to this plan that we've talked about all along about God allowing the people to have a king, what his expectation was for a king in reigning over the people, and how things proceeded and the effect that it had on the kingdom, we'll look at all that as we go along here. Okay. So we're about halfway down here, down to lesson 5. And so you can see after this evening, we'll be looking again back at the southern kingdom and tracing that from the time of Solomon until the end of that kingdom. So that's actually that's, 3 other lessons having to do with the southern kingdom there after this evening, looking at the northern kingdom. Okay, so as we think about this kingdom, I think I've mentioned before, the kingdom divides. It's united up until the point of Solomon. We've got Saul, David, and then Solomon, each reigning 40 years. And then at the death of Solomon, as we'll see, the kingdom divides and splits into 2 there. And so up in the north, we have different kings reigning for a period of time, and that kingdom lasts approximately 200 years, from about, I think it's 941, if I've got the date right, to about 722 BC, so a little over 200 years. Whereas in the south, once the kingdom divides, it lasts all the way up until 586 BC, so about 150 years or so later. And so, like we have said, we've got 2 sets of histories concerning both of these kingdoms, and we're going to look at 1st and 2nd Kings this evening when we're talking about the northern kingdom. And the reason is that when you get to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, those 2 books almost don't mention the northern kings, okay? So if you're going to get some information about the northern kingdom and the kings that reigned there, you've got to go to 1st and 2nd Kings. Whereas with 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you've got a little bit of information about the United Kingdom, a little bit of information, quite a bit about David, quite a bit about Solomon. We looked at that last time. And then from that point after Solomon, about the only thing you hear about the northern kings is when they have any sort of contact with what's happening in the southern kingdom. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are concerned primarily with the southern kingdom. And so the next 3 weeks, we'll talk a little bit about that, why that's the case. But like I say, we got started in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Now we're going to loop over there to 1st and 2nd Kings just to get an overview of the northern kingdom. All right, so just tell me offhand, what's your impression of the northern kingdom? If you were going to mention anything about the northern kingdom, how would you classify or categorize the northern kingdom? Pardon me? Bad leadership, okay. Not good kings, right? Okay. And so we'll see that that's going to be the case tonight. In fact, it's almost like a drumbeat when you go through each of those listing, this king reigns and he did what was evil and he continued in the sins of Jeroboam. and he was more evil than those who were before him. Now, there are a few exceptions in terms of things that are said about them, so it's not just exclusively evil, but that seems to be the general run of things. Okay, anything else about the northern kingdom? Anything else that stands out in your mind? Bad kings? Anything else? Didn't obey God, okay? So that's where the evil comes from, not respecting his wishes, not being what a king's supposed to be. And really the template for the northern king was the same as the template for the southern king, which was you need to obey God. And that was the expectation, but they didn't do it. And we'll see that that was the case from the get-go, really. Michael? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it's not like everything was going just great and then suddenly this king kind of got wound up and went the wrong direction. No, you're right. I mean, the idolatry that we're talking about has been existing back since the time of the judges. Okay. Maybe less so during the United Kingdom, but certainly it existed all along. So we'll kind of trace that as we go along. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think we can go right back to square A and say you're supposed to go in and drive the people out. They didn't do it. And Judges starts hinting at that. And, you know, not only did they not drive them out, they're getting driven back up into the hill country. And so they're starting to adopt the sorts of practices of the people when it's supposed to be the other way around. Drive them out and keep God's law. Okay, good. So I think as we said, so really what you've got here is like A, B, A, which is one kingdom, the United Kingdom, two kingdoms once it's divided, and then once the northern kingdom falls, you're back to one kingdom. Okay? So that's the history. I think we've all got a sense of that, and we'll come back and summarize a few other things as we go along. So 19 kings, that's about 2 minutes per king. So we're gonna go through this kind of hurriedly, but I think you'll see, you know, what the design is as we go along, and we'll be summarizing a lot of the history. So we said last time Solomon did start well, but what happens in chapter 11 of 1 Kings? Suddenly you get a big road bump there. Okay, verse 1. He loved many foreign women. And it says, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. So you've got Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite. Those are some of the people surrounding them. And it's said right there in verse 2. He was doing the opposite of what God said, which was, you shall not enter into marriage with them. Neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. So then you read 700 wives, 300 concubines, and then look at the end of verse 3. Surprise, his wives turned away his heart. And his heart, verse 4, was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. So the standard, in a sense, is David, and he's not measuring up to that standard. It also says, verse 5, they went after the Ashtaroth, Milcom. These are some of the gods around. Verse 7, Chemosh from Moab, Molech from the Ammonites. And I think it says here somewhere that, well, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So the Lord says, down in verse 11, let me go ahead and give us some of this information. The Lord was angry with Solomon, verse 9, because his heart was turned away from the Lord. And so the God who had appeared to him twice commanded these things, that he should not go after other gods, but he didn't keep what the Lord commanded. So that, verse 11, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you, and I'll give it to your servant. And yet, verse 12, what does he say? I won't do what? Verse 12 and 13. Okay. I won't take it all away. I'll leave one tribe there, and that's for the sake of David, my servant. Okay. So the rest of chapter 11 and chapter 12, well, really chapter 11, are some of those adversaries that are raised up, one of which is Jeroboam, verse 26 in chapter 11, I believe it is. And notice in verse 28, Jeroboam was very able and he was industrious. That's the kind of person you want, don't you? So he gave him charge over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. But then a prophet by the name of Ahijah seeks out Jeroboam, and what does he tell him down in verse 31, 32? What's God got in mind as far as this kingdom? Takes his garment, tears it into 12 pieces, and gives him how many? 10. It says, you're going to get 10 tribes. So that's interesting, isn't it? You know, one tribe down in the south, 10 tribes up in the north, but he says, you'll receive this kingdom, and gives that to him. But look at verse 38. He says to him, well, I'll back up to verse 36. Yet to his son I will give one tribe, that David my servant may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem. Okay, so that's Rehoboam. And then he says in verse 38, if you will listen to all that I command you and will walk in my ways and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and my commandments, as David my servant did, what? Yeah, it sounds a little bit like the promises made to David. I'll be with you. I'll build you a sure house. Now, we talked about David. That house is not building, it's dynasty, family. And so he seems to promise that here to Jeroboam, as I built for David. All you've got to do is obey. Well, of course, that's not what happens. So, let's proceed then. And notice that we've got Jeroboam and Rehoboam in chapters 12 to 14. And that story develops there. Rehoboam makes this mistake right off the bat of saying, well, when they come to him, they say, make it a little bit easier for us. And apparently, in building the temple and building some of those other projects that Solomon had, he's taken advantage of the people, which shouldn't be surprised, because what did we say about God's warning about the kings? Yeah, that they might well do that he might tax the people, that he might take from the people in order to accomplish his own projects. And so that's exactly apparently what has happened. Rehoboam then says what? What's his reaction when they say, please make it a little easier for us? Yeah, exactly. You haven't seen anything yet. It's going to be more difficult. Well, so Jeroboam comes back from Egypt, where he's gone to hide, and when he gets back, and Shechem is right there in the middle of the country, and that's where Rehoboam gathers the people together. And so when they hear this response from Rehoboam, they say, we're going our own way. They make Jeroboam king, and now we've got two kingdoms, don't we? Two different nations, so to speak. Okay, so the kingdom divides. There's your map there, kind of split down the middle. Jerusalem is up there close to the border between those two. And so the tribe of Judah is in the south there, with the lineage of David sitting and ruling on the throne. Okay, and what do we know about Jeroboam's reign? What does he do right from the outset? Chapter 12, verses 25 to 33. What's his strategy? He doesn't want them going down to Jerusalem, because he's afraid he'll lose the people. And so he changes everything, or a lot of things about the worship, sets up a golden calf at both Dan and Bethel, sort of northern and southern extremities, He makes temples on the high places. He sets up, I think it says it sets up idols there. He appoints priests other than the Levites, and we'll follow up on that next time as far as what happens down in the south as a result of that. He changes the feast days, and notice it says he devised these things from his own heart. He was making this up as he went. And I think that really ends up being at the top of the list there. He's doing this his way, and that's the kind of wisdom he's applying to this situation. Well, in chapter 13, a man of God comes up to Bethel and really approaches Jeroboam as he's there offering worship. And he rebukes him, and then there's a story that follows about the prophet. We won't be concerned with that right now. But one of the things that Jeroboam is told, well, in chapter 14, his son becomes sick, Abijah, and he's told by another prophet that his son's going to die, and that's exactly what happens. Okay? So, not a very auspicious start as far as that northern kingdom is concerned. Now, another son, Nadab, is next to rule on the throne after Jeroboam, and I didn't put down here how long Jeroboam reigned. And we're not all that concerned other than to note in some cases, it's not very long. In other cases, there are some who reign quite a while. I don't see it here. Okay, so we'll go on. What'd you say? How long? 22, okay. So he reigned a couple of decades, all right? And his son then reigns after him, Nadab. He does evil, and that's kind of, like I say, a constant refrain. He's killed by Baasha, and this is kind of interesting. Nadab is down fighting at this place called Gibbethon against the Philistines, and as they're laying siege to the city, one of these other men comes and kills him. So you kind of got a feel now for what starts to happen with these different kings, and this is going to happen a lot as we go along. Okay, so here's his son who takes over the throne, and then he's put to death, and I think I had on your lesson sheet a little symbol of a sword. So Baasha takes over. Let's see what happens with his reign. He reigns 24 years, lengthy reign. He does evil. He walks in the way of Jeroboam. As I said, he kills Nadab while Nadab is laying siege to this town where the Philistines are. But notice what else he does. He wipes out the house of Jeroboam. So, you've got Nadab and Jeroboam both dead, but why would he do this? Chapter 15, I think, verse 29. Yeah, I'm looking for it. I can't find it. Oh, yeah. Verse 29. As soon as he was king, he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He left to the house of Jeroboam not one that breathed until he had destroyed it. What's the point? You're wiping out the family, aren't you? So these two men have been king, father and son. Well, now all their descendants are taken care of. So they're not going to be reigning. And this fulfills the word of Ahijah back in chapter 14, who said that this would happen to the household of Jeroboam. Okay, so the tone's kind of set here. You can see what's happening. You've got different kings that reign, and they reign for quite a while, and yet the family is wiped out at the end of that. And a curse is placed on his house, chapter 16, by a prophet named Jehu. This is not the king Jehu later on. Okay. Well, let's go to the next king, and that is Elah. And he's the son of Baasha. And his servant Zimri conspires against him and kills him while he's drinking. It says he got drunk. And so Zimri kills him. And so once more, you have another lineage, someone who was a commander in the army killing the man who was reigning as king. Okay? So that's a second family, numbers 1 and 2 there, and they've both been eliminated, and now Zimri is sitting on the throne. Okay, so chapter 16, verse 11, he struck down the house of Baasha. He did not leave him a single male of his relatives or his friends. And so he destroys that household. Okay, so Zimri kills Elah. He wipes out the household of Baasha, that second dynasty. He reigns all of 7 days. Isn't that wonderful? He reigns for a week. And then another commander, Omri, takes Zimri's life and conspires against him and kills him. And, well, actually, that's not right. Because he attacks him, it says that Zimri goes into the king's house and sets it on fire and burns it. And so he's taken out of the picture. Okay? So, a third dynasty that ends in death and someone's life being taken. This time he takes his own life. All right, so the house of Omri, starting in chapter 16. Let's consider what happens to him. He's the one that's responsible for the death of Zimri. Notice it says that he bought the hill of Samaria. Verse 24. Yeah, let me get down to. He succeeds to the throne. He actually struggles with someone else, and he buys a place in Samaria and establishes that as the capital. So Samaria becomes the capital of the northern kingdom, just as Jerusalem had become the capital of the southern kingdom. And Omri rules there. He does evil. He walks in the ways of Jeroboam. It mentions idols as a part of what he does. And when he dies, who takes over for him? Ahab is the son of Omri. So this dynasty of Omri is significant. It's the fourth one on the list here. And it's significant. Look at chapter 16, verses 29 to 34. Several things that are mentioned there. Of course, Ahab does evil, verse 30. Okay, that's no surprise. He did not consider it a light thing or a trivial thing, some versions have, to do evil as he did. Verse 31. And as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and went and served Baal and worshiped him. Now, if you're highlighting verses, you might highlight verse 31, because that's significant. Why? You now have a king. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Joshua, sorry. Okay. Okay. All right. So now you've got a king that's supposed to be following God, who marries a queen who's from the Sidonian kingdom there, and they worship Baal, and now they introduce Baal worship into the northern kingdom. Actively doing that. Endorsement, as you say. Okay. So that's important, because that sets things really going the wrong way. It says, verse 32, he erected an altar of Baal in the house of Baal, which he built in Samaria. Verse 33, he did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. Okay, so made the Asherah, which is kind of the consort of Baal, did more to provoke the Lord than all the previous kings. All right, so here we are, 4 dynasties in. Son of Omri is Ahab. He's married Jezebel. And really from this point onward, a lot of the story surrounds Ahab, the worship of Baal, and what prophet comes on the scene? Elijah, okay? So, you've got Elijah in chapter 17 who suddenly appears and says there's going to be a famine. And from that point onward, through the rest of 1 Kings, everything is surrounding this contest between Elijah the prophet and Ahab and Jezebel on the other hand. Which is to say, the narrative in 1 Kings and 2 Kings is really tracing what's happening to the northern kingdom in terms of this Baal worship. And not only will it affect them, ultimately it will leak down into the southern kingdom by virtue of a daughter that marries into the southern kings. Now, those are the sections we often study, rightly so. I mean, they're very interesting, a lot of good stories in there, but we're not going to do that this evening. But my point is that blue box there is illustrating, if you put the amount of text about those kings that had preceded compared to what happens there with Elijah, you've got a lot less text concerning the kings. The contest really has to do with Baal versus God. And so that story is traced through. A prophet of God appears on the scene, and tell me what that prophet does besides talking to Ahab and Jezebel. What's another thing that's typical of prophets or later apostles that you don't always see? Yeah, miracles that are done. You know, he calls upon God, and God brings down fire upon the altar in Mount Carmel when they have this contest between the prophets of Baal and the prophets of God. Okay, so we'll bypass the rest of that history other than to say that's what's happening in the very middle of 1st and 2nd Kings. This conflict is going on, this contest, this competition between God and Baal. So after Ahab dies, and of course there's a lot connected with that, you've got Ahaziah, his son, taking over. Notice he serves Baal, he provokes God. He gets sick. It says he fell through a lattice work. And instead of going to God and asking about it, he sends 50 of his men to be at Beelzebub in order to find out. And Elijah confronts them and says, why are you going to him? Why don't you ask God about it? And Ahaziah responds by, well, Elijah sends fire and consumes those 50 men. Ahaziah sends 2 other groups of 50 men, and they're consumed by fire. You think God's trying to say something about what you're doing here? And so ultimately, Ahaziah dies. He doesn't survive. Okay? So he's trying to reverse God's judgment, the pronouncement of death, but he doesn't survive. And according to God's word, he dies. All right, Jehoram is the son of Ahaziah. Notice in chapter 3, there's a description there about a battle with Moab, but it says he put away Baal, but continued to sin after Jeroboam. So that's interesting. Like I said earlier, that you do have some who at least make some kind of effort to do something right. And that's the case with Jehoram. Okay, he teams with Jehoshaphat, who is king of Judah, and they defeat the Moabites. All right, so notice what we've got here. This dynasty of Omri. Ahab, then Ahaziah, and about this time in 2 Kings chapter 2, Elijah departs, and who's chosen to take his place? Elisha. Okay? So Jehoram reigns, 2 Kings 3, they defeat the Moabites, and then Elisha comes on the scene. And notice that from chapter 4 to chapter 8 in 2 Kings, yes, it mentions some of these kings, but it really focuses again on the prophet, on Elisha. And there are a lot of great stories in there that we know. And we're not going to go into those this evening, but the point being that God has sent his prophets to speak to the people to try to turn them around, albeit unsuccessfully, as far as what the people end up doing. Okay, so at the end of Jehoram, there's an individual named Jehu that succeeds to the throne. What's the story about Jehu? Anybody know that one? He's not from the dynasty of Omri. God speaks to him as a prophet, and he is told to avenge the dynasty of Omri. Interesting, isn't it? So here God is sending somebody else to take care of Omri and his family who have done so much to cause the people to turn away. And so what Jehu does, he takes his role seriously, and he goes and slays a king from the south and a king from the north, Joram and Ahaziah. And then he causes the death of Jezebel. It was prophesied that she would be thrown down and you wouldn't be able to find her, basically. And that's exactly what comes to pass as a result of Jehu's actions. And then he goes and wipes out all the descendants of Ahab, 70 sons that they take, and they says, bring me their heads. And so the people do that, and so gone is the family of Omri, the dynasty, as well as Ahab. And to his credit, notice he demolishes the prophets of Baal there in chapter 10. So, as we said, not everyone is just joining in with this worship of Baal, and Jehu makes an attempt to curtail that. But notice chapter 10, verse 28 to 31, they fail to remove the golden calves. So for all the good that he does, and for carrying out God's command as far as the family of Omri, and particularly Ahab and Jezebel, he also fails in terms of making a complete return back to God. And it's interesting, later on in Hosea, there's kind of a prophecy that Hosea issues, which seems to suggest that Jehu and his family are going to be judged. And they're judged because it seems like Jehu got caught up in this revenge thing. And so God ends up judging him. But he tells Jehu that his family, up until the 4th generation, is going to sit on the throne. Okay. Jehoahaz is next on the throne. He doesn't depart from the sins. And then you start having some conflict in the northern kingdom with some of the Syrian kings that are just up there to the north. So he's given into the hand of Hazael of Syria. And we're told in verse 4 of chapter 13 that he finds favor. Verse 4, then Jehoahaz sought the favor of the Lord, and the Lord listened to him, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Syria oppressed him. So again, it wasn't just 100% evil. You have an individual now and then, a king that's reigning, who makes some sort of attempt to do what God says. Hazael, the Syrian leader, reduces his army, and ultimately his son Jehoash takes over. He doesn't depart from those sins. This is the king that, remember the story about Elisha? He says, you need to strike the arrows on the ground. Remember how many times he does it? He does it 3 times, and Elisha gets angry. Why? He says if you'd struck it 5 times, you'd win 5 battles. But since you only struck it 3 times, you're only going to win 3 battles. Okay? And so, true to form, he does win 3 battles against the Syrians during his reign. Notice in chapter 13 at verse 22, there is this mention made concerning the covenant that God makes with Abraham. Verse 22, now Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. But the Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them, and he turned toward them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, nor has he cast them from his presence until now. So again, just to point out that there are occasions where God acts in a favorable way toward them because of what they've done. So yes, he defeats the Syrians 3 times, but and then he defeats the king in Judah and takes actually some of the spoil from Jerusalem. All right, the next descendant in the family there of Jehu is Jeroboam the second. He reigns 41 years. What might that suggest? If you read that somebody sat on the throne for 41 years, verses 7 days say that we saw earlier. Okay, a time of peace. And in fact, what's happened is the Assyrians are kind of distracted with other things that are going on. The Syrians seem to kind of lay off for a while, and so the northern kingdom enjoys some prosperity for a period of time. So economically, they're doing pretty good, but do they return to God? They don't. And so therein lies their problem. They're kind of doomed at this point. They're still doing evil, even though they prosper economically. It is said that he restores the borders back to what they had been. I'll show you that in just a moment. And it's also said that the Lord did not blot out Israel, but save them by the hand of Jeroboam. So not a very big map there, but you can see up there to the north that the area has been extended beyond what would normally have been the case. So they prosper under Jeroboam. All right, we'll accelerate things here. Zechariah reigns for 6 months. He does evil. He's put to death by another individual named Shallum, who reigns in his place. And so just as it had been prophesied to Jehu, there were 4 of his generations that ruled. So the dynasty of Omri and the dynasty of Jehu last beyond a couple of generations. And so those are significant dynasties, one because of its evil, the other because God brings revenge. So notice the different descendants of Jehu, the 4 generations. Shallum comes along. And really from this point, it's downhill in terms of the northern kingdom. Shallum reigns 1 month, and he's put to death. He is said to exercise brutality against some of the women there in the country. All right. Pekahiah is the son of Menahem, reigns for 10 years, does evil, pays tribute to the Assyrian king. So Assyria has risen up in the sort of the northeast, and some of these kings are starting to have to pay tribute in order to continue their independence. All right, so Pekahiah reigns for 2 years. He does evil. He's put to death by his captain Pekah. All right. And so as we wind down here, he does reign for 20 years, does evil, and then a king by the name of Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser takes the people captive away to Assyria. And Hoshea reigns after Pekah, and finally Hoshea reigns, does evil, pays tribute until he rebels against the Assyrian king, and he asks for help from the king of Egypt, and that's when Shalmaneser, next Assyrian king, comes and takes them away into captivity. All right. 19 kings, 9 dynasties, Two of the major ones, Omri, the fourth dynasty, the family of Ahab, turns away from God, introduces Baal worship, and then Jehu, the fifth dynasty, who really accomplishes revenge as far as the evil that's done by Ahab. All right, here's what I would suggest as some key points. We've said they were mostly evil, the kings were. Jeroboam disobeyed in order to gain loyalty. The whole thing got off on the wrong foot, didn't it? Turns away from God, makes his own religion, takes the people with him, and they were never going to survive after that. All the kings follow suit, so that's not much of a template to work with. We talked about the dynasties, which were for the most part unstable, people being murdered, conspiracies, just a lot of instability. And finally, they were taken into captivity. All right. So as we close, you think about the kind of king that God wanted, the kind of king that David was despite his imperfections. What's the die that's cast there in the northern kingdom? It's not a good one. And probably surprising they lasted as long as they did, a little over 200 years. But that's what we know about the northern kingdom. So next time we're going to focus on the southern kingdom starting at the death of Solomon, and we'll take the next 3 lessons and trace through what happens to the southern kingdom. All right, we'll stop there.